the notions we take out of your presentation, 80% of the 500 billion invested in communities where less than 50% of people have median revenue under 50% of the national average. I think it's really interesting. And the item about the problem that migrated from demand to supply. All of this is very interesting for Canada, specifically when it comes to instating a sustainable security for both our country. Next panel, we'll talk about reconciliation and clean energy projects with Indigenous peoples. Do not forget, you can ask questions to our panelists by scanning the QR codes that are on the tables in the room or by clicking the link that was sent to you by email. So please welcome Mr. Jordan Peterson, President and CEO of Affinity North, who will moderate our next panel.
Good afternoon, everyone. How about a round of applause for our moderators? Welcome. We are going to kick off with a Slido, if you guys want to pull it up. And the question is, which provincial or territorial jurisdiction has the most promising policy landscape for Indigenous participation in clean energy? Reminder, the QR code is on your table as well. And as we do that, as we wait for the results, we'll do a quick introduction of our panel. And I'll start off. My name is Jordan Peterson. Not that Jordan Peterson. Gwichin from Clavic Northwest Territories, which is the most northwestern community in the Northwest Territories. And I am the President CEO of Affinity North. It's an honor to be here. Thanks to CCI for the invite to come moderate this panel of Indigenous powerhouses and close friends of mine. We'll be talking a little bit about Indigenous clean energy projects, Indigenous prosperity, and how we come together to build a future in the clean energy space. So I'll hand it over to Hillary to do an introduction of herself, and then we'll do Cole, and then Lisa.
Super. So I'm Hillary Thatcher, and I'm the Managing Director of Indigenous and Northern Investments at the Canada Infrastructure Bank. I have a long, storied career with public service. I joined the bank in 2020 really with a focus, and I have the best job in the world, but with a focus of both closing the infrastructure gap facing First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities, but also finding a path for economic inclusion on the major infrastructure projects that are being built across Canada where CIB is making an investment. So I am of Métis ancestry from Alberta. My husband's Inuk, so I'm happy to see another Inuk on this panel to talk a little bit about the interesting opportunities and some of the challenges of the Arctic.
Thanks, Hillary. Yeah, I agree. You have the best and coolest job, I think. I see all these projects across Canada and help facilitate First Nations participation in these clean energy projects. So thank you for your work and your leadership on that front. My new Nuu-chah-nulth name is Kwatuma. I am Hupa Chasat. We're one of the Nuu-chah-nulth nations on the west coast of Vancouver Island. We are power producers. We rely on the rain and provide winter power in British Columbia. I am the current Executive Director of Clean Energy BC, which represents the clean energy industry in British Columbia, and that's made up of industry members, but also about 80 BC First Nations. BC First Nations, there's significant interest in wanting to build clean energy projects in a range, and we'll get into that. But very happy to be here, and over to you, Lisa.
Yes, I'm so pleased to be here with you all, and my name is Lisa Chiloqui Khopikwaluk. I am originally from Puvernitok in Nunavik in northern Quebec, and I'm the president of Inuit Circumpolar Council of Canada, and that also makes me vice chair of Inuit Circumpolar Council, more largely, which is an international organization that's composed of ICC Chukotka, ICC Alaska, ICC Canada, and ICC Greenland. So we represent over 180,000 Inuit who live across Inuit Nunat, our homeland, and push for, advocate for the exercise of our right to participate in decision-making processes at the international level. Thanks.
Thanks,
Good
everyone.
to be here with you.
Thank you, Lisa. I used to co-chair Gwich'in Council International, and I've been fortunate enough to visit Berlin with Lisa a number of years ago and travel across the country with our other panelists. I live in Whitehorse, Yukon, and to kick us off in terms of understanding the conversation today, wanting to acknowledge that my belief is that Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous values is our path to trying to live up to the challenge of climate change. And what I mean by that is that the values and principles of Indigenous people of reciprocity and being stewards of the land, that those are important factors as we move forward. And I think myself and Hillary and Cole will agree with the polling results here. Maybe the Yukon as well, but I'm a bit biased on that front, because I do believe that there is real unique opportunity to be able to live up to the challenge that our ancestors have put forward for us, and to be aligned with those cultural values and our Indigenous knowledge to really move forward in a good way. And to kick us off, Lisa, I'm going to start with you with our initial question, and just thinking about policy barriers and how we're moving forward. What are some of the biggest policy barriers you've encountered in advancing Indigenous clean energy, but also internationally, and thinking about your role at ICC and the challenge of the Arctic Council and permanent participants and the Indigenous Peoples Secretariat? So just thinking about the policy landscape there.
All right, so I'll kick this off. I think that advancing Inuit participation in clean energy projects, there's always been challenges for sure, especially from an Arctic perspective. And so the experiences we've lived have revealed significant policy barriers that often stem from a lack of recognition of the unique experiences and needs of Inuit. So across Inuit, Nunat, our own experiences vary widely, whether in Canada, Greenland, Chukotka, or Alaska, due to the differing governance structures and the political realities and resource availability and the cultural contexts. There is so much diversity that it means there's not one size that fits all. And so we need an approach that takes into account these diversities for clean energy initiatives. So instead of tailored policies, we must reflect policies that take in the specific realities and needs of each of the regions. But one of the primary barriers is the insufficient integration. You mentioned Indigenous knowledge earlier, and that's also really important for Inuit Circumpolar Council, that it be taken into account into energy policy frameworks. So current policies often overlook this, and it can offer invaluable insights into sustainable practices and local environment conditions and migration patterns, for example. And without incorporating this knowledge, projects risk being ineffective or even harmful. And an example of this is in Sápmi, Sami land on the Fosen case that we've been learning about from our Sami partners, where a wind farm was built in Norway without their free, prior, and informed consent. And that has led to devastating impacts to the Sami and on their livelihoods and rights. And another significant barrier is the lack of meaningful consultation and engagement in decision-making processes. Many policies are developed, have been developed at the international level without adequate input from us, Inuit. And those have led to projects that do not align with our values or priorities. So, nor the Arctic reality whatsoever. So our voice has been marginalized. Indigenous voices not being heard undermines potential for successful collaboration. So there needs to be also, for example, reliable energy in case of emergency and equipment malfunction. So when there are green energy projects being built in the Arctic, there's no guarantee that only that form of green energy will maintain the energy. So there always has to be another source that depends on diesel to keep energy going. So we need to be able to look for energy projects that really work. And we can look at the Inuvialuit example. Inuvialuit in the Northwest Territories have been doing projects that are reducing carbon dioxide emissions per year. And that's an example of some Inuit groups leading projects that are beneficial to their communities. So secondly, I think I have a lot to say, but secondly, policies must recognize, as I mentioned earlier, and I think I won't repeat that, but the diversity of Inuit experiences across different regions. You know, that's worth repeating. We need to ensure that when we work with Inuit, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. And finally, integrating Indigenous governance systems into energy planning can help ensure that clean energy projects align with our community goals. So consistently checking back with community and adjusting as the project unfolds. Now, this could be a very interesting process when engaging with communities, with Indigenous communities, with Inuit communities, whose environments are so different from Southern Canada environments. So it's always a new experience for many who are dealing with us. So at the same time that they must learn about our communities, at the same time they're learning to engage with our communities. So homework is always important to do ahead of time. Learn about the communities. But supporting Indigenous-led initiatives not only empowers our communities, but fosters a just transition that prioritizes our rights and perspectives. So I think I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. And coming back to the Indigenous knowledge statement, I think, you know, when we were trying to make that transition from traditional knowledge to Indigenous knowledge at the Arctic Council, and just recognizing that our Indigenous knowledge is living and breathing, and we evolve with the times, and as we think about the types of policy, like specific policy changes that need to be made, Hillary or Cole, could you maybe point something out, whether it be in a provincial, federal jurisdiction, from a policy lens that you think that if we made this one specific change, it would open up deeper collaboration between Indigenous communities in the rest of Canada?
Yeah, maybe I'll start, and then if you want to chime in. So I think there's a few things that have been happening in Canada to create a more inclusive transition, one that includes First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities and peoples. Part of it, I would say, and I was a little disappointed in the results of that survey, because I would say that in 2009, with the launch of the Ontario Green Energy and Economy Act, we actually saw policy change the way that businesses and industry works with Indigenous communities. And it was a carrot that was dangled. It was called an Aboriginal Price Adder and an Aboriginal Loan Guarantee Program. And that was in 2009. And I can tell you that that Aboriginal Price Adder that was offered, when you tell industry that your power is more valuable if you have an Indigenous partner, an Indigenous equity partner, they look for an Indigenous equity partner. You get paid more for your power. And so that was a bottom line that really helped to transition Ontario's energy system and get us off of coal in order to achieve the clean power outcomes that we have today, where now you're not seeing projects being built in Ontario without Indigenous partners. So that's one example. I would say some negative examples, which I think we need to think about, happen at the federal level. And I think about the tax credits right now. I think about the exclusion of the Arctic from carbon tax and from policies to transition to net zero. So right now in the Arctic, most of the Inuit communities, for example, run diesel generators for their electricity. They are small communities typically, and so there's not a lot of incentive or a large rate base in order to afford the transition. It requires a lot of government grants. It requires a policy change to actually to shift and to listen to Inuit voices who want to shift off diesel. They don't want diesel generators in the middle of their communities. But we haven't been brave enough as a country to find that opportunity to collaborate in order that we can work with Inuit, for example, in the Arctic or diesel-reliant communities to find a path to transition off of fossil fuels. So I think there's a number of elements. The tax credits as well are a bit of a problem, and I know that a number of Indigenous communities have put forward submissions to the federal government because the tax credits for Indigenous participants is different at a different rate than for industry, and that's a problem because it disincentivizes industry from partnering with Indigenous communities or bringing them in later into the game, which means that their equity stakes are diminished. But we're seeing a lot of great promise with Aboriginal loan guarantees. It started in 2009 in Ontario. 10 years later, Alberta adopted it. BC has recently, the federal government, Manitoba's announced it. And when I look at the call for power in Quebec, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, as well as Saskatchewan, they're all driving projects that are going to have and are going to require Indigenous partners. So I think that we're seeing a lot of positive momentum.
Maybe just to jump in there on the collaboration piece, and I'll hand it over to you, Cole. You know, thinking about the way that provinces and territories are doing these calls for power, it somewhat pits communities against each other in a number of different ways. And I just want to maybe ask you, Cole, when these types of calls for power happen, what role do you think collaboration plays in actually moving these kinds of projects forward when provinces or territories are announcing these calls for power?
Yeah, collaboration amongst communities. I think one of the transition side, we're seeing nations who want to come together as a coalition to see what type of co-ownership is possible for facilitating transmission ownership, whether it's that coalition in the utility or a private developer. With respect to clean energy, we have a pretty strong foundation for industry partnerships with First Nations in facilitating the building of these projects. So I think right now under current procurements, that's where we're at, these industry First Nations partnerships. And that's where we see a greater equity stakes in these projects. And one of the things I note too is I was really glad to hear Michael Sabia mentioned governance rights. I mean, he said that the financial benefit, which is also key, but another aspect is governance rights in the project. That way we can facilitate the traditional knowledge into the project so that they have a say in the early phase of project development, construction, all the way to the end, operations. And our friends at Indigenous Clean Energy, their research shows that when there's more First Nations governance, there's going to be more successful project outcomes.
Thanks for that, Cole. And I'll come right back to you. Just thinking about, how can storytelling and the way that indigenous communities learn and teach, and how do you think that aspect of our cultural identity as indigenous people, not to pan-indigenize anything, but like, how do you think storytelling really can contribute to achieving the type of success that we're seeing in indigenous communities, and how can that contribute to the perception or even influence policy?
Yeah, and that's a great question, storytelling. And I want to put it to the crowd, how many people have visited a renewable energy site here? There's some, there's quite a few. Now, how many folks have spoken with the First Nations operators or owners of those projects? There's a good amount. That's great. And that's where I think the storytelling is best heard, is when you're listening to the First Nations owners and operators of these projects. My nation, we were one of the early Indigenous-led clean energy projects of the 6-megawatt Run River in the early 2000s. And two of our members have been operating for 15 years. So that type of long-term operational jobs have been transformative for my community of 300. And it is a small project in comparison to utility scale projects, but a lot of our projects are below that utility scale. So hearing the community members talk about their pride in building it, I've had the privilege to go to the Noai Valley, the Honeygatine, and how they built the underlying transmission line, which is like safer because there's a wildfire that ripped through that territory in 2017. Same story with the Silcotin with their 1.25 solar project. They built that through a wildfire and then the flooding, but they persevered. It took longer to build it, but they built it themselves, and they own it and they operate it. And so hearing that their pride in building the project and owning it and the revenue that comes from it is what makes this whole thing, that's why we do it. It's a capacity building, it's providing energy security for our region and advancing energy sovereignty, whatever that means for the nation.
That's cool. Lisa, do you have anything to add to that question around storytelling?
Sure. I think, with our many, many communities in Inuit Nunat, for example, in Canada, we have over 50 Inuit communities remote, and so all running on diesel energy. So, and within Inuit Nunat, we listen to each other, we're hearing, newscasts, articles, reading about renewable energy projects that are being started by Inuit communities. And these are the stories told using their knowledge, using all of that deep knowledge that they have of their environment. So, for example, the community of Inukjuak has started running energy on a run-of-the-river hydroelectric project that they began. And this began with their desire, their need to contribute to, the betterment of their community and to, create energy that's less harmful to, less emitting greenhouse gas. So this story is told through social media, through public consultations, through elders' knowledge, and all for, to create these innovative technologies and to contribute to the well-being of their communities. And this is told with their own words. And this is how one contributes to, the larger picture as well. But it starts in the community. It's not someone else telling us, we can only run our homes, get electricity and heating from this source, It's us saying, well, we are going to do this, and we're going to do it with our knowledge as well. So when people hear of the first-hand accounts of positive impacts such as this, these are beneficial for community health, for economic development and cultural preservation. And it humanizes the whole issue here. And so, yeah, I think all of the mediums that we can use in social media, filmmaking, news media, formal radio, written, all of these serve their purpose in us telling our stories.
Thank you, Lisa. Just from a show of hands, how many of you have heard of the Old Crow Solar Project? And sorry to do this, Rosa, to kind of call you out here a little bit. My friend Rosa in the crowd is a real example of how a non-Indigenous person can support and work with an Indigenous community, especially one as remote as Old Crow and the Vuntut-Gwitchin government. And the power that young people's voices bring to these projects, whether it be through 7Gen or Student Energy or whatever the organization might be, I think just shows the examples of the type of capacity that Indigenous communities have, the type of influence that we have on actually large-scale policy, whether that be national, international, or even in the Yukon. The Old Crow Project and the Vuntut-Gwitchin government and the youth that were working on that project, there would not be a PPA in the Yukon without that project driving the type of reconciliation that's needed to be able to ensure that Indigenous communities are moving forward in their own way, whether that be for energy sovereignty, reducing the cost of living, or really reducing, our dependency on diesel, especially in an Arctic community. And Hillary, just moving into opportunities, and I completely agree with you and Cole. I think you do have one of the coolest jobs in the country. What significant opportunities you believe are out there to project Canada to be a energy leader and a clean energy leader, and to be able to meet the targets that have been put forward in the Paris Agreement?
I mentioned it earlier. Most jurisdictions now have their call for power. There's a need to increase renewables in order to meet our use in this country. And it's from coast to coast to coast. And so one of the things we did at the CIB was we begged the federal government, our shareholder, to give us the authority to lend equity directly to communities so that we don't have to provide a loan guarantee if they're participating in a project which is within our mandate, clean power being one of those areas. We can do a direct loan for equity. So this is really, it shouldn't be so novel, but it is novel. We lend at really concessionary pricing so that communities have access to affordable capital so they can invest in projects. So we went around the country when calls for power had been coming out and partnered with the utilities and the territorial or provincial government to put together sort of a standard offer so that we would make a loan to the project, but we would also, by making a loan to a project in their jurisdiction, whether it was BC, Saskatchewan, we're working with Manitoba right now, Quebec, we've done calls for power in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick. So wherever we're putting these packages together, we will provide both debt to the project, so that's helping to reduce the burden that this transition is going to have on ratepayers. Because if there's not subsidies and there's not grants, costs are definitely going to be going up, and every jurisdiction wants to manage that because ratepayers matter, and especially when you get into the north, the ratepayers are even burdened even further. And so making sure that we can help reduce the impact to ratepayers, but also ensure that Indigenous communities have access to affordable capital so they can be investors in projects. Because as Cole said earlier, when Indigenous communities invest in projects, when they're at the table, both as an investor, an equity investor, but they have a governance say at the project level, projects get built better. They're built on time, they're built on budget typically, and this is a good thing for the country and to speed up that transition to meet our renewable requirements. So we're now providing equity loans. We'll be in excess of $1 billion this year. And it's just I would say that in the Indigenous investment space at the Infrastructure Bank, it certainly is the growth market, and clean power in particular is where we're seeing a lot of activity for equity loans for Indigenous communities. And we can lend to one community or many communities, so not to pit communities against each other, it's to try and create that space for communities to co-own and to be a part of this transition, because it aligns typically with the values of First Nation, Métis, Inuit communities, but it also aligns with the aspirations of our country, of Canadians to reduce our dependency on fossil fuels.
Yeah. And maybe not necessarily our last question, but something really looking forward, and Cole, because you're so youthful these days, and as Jordan knows, it's Uncle Cole, right? As we look to the future, what steps do we need to take to ensure that Indigenous voices are and remain at the center of Canada's clean future?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that I'd like to hear from you all. How do we uphold Indigenous voices? Indigenous communities have been leading this. They've been fighting, whether it's in government offices here or at utilities, fighting for opportunities, fighting for funding. I was in Heshkwe First Nation because they just completed their 350 kilowatt run-of-river microhydro. They're a diesel-dependent community. They have solar battery that's now displacing 90% of their diesel. They don't have to barge in diesel into the very west coast of Vancouver Island. And their late chief was always adamant to, Gord Johns, the MP, in ISK, like why are you so, remember some people in ISK were like, why do you care so much about 40 people? Because the cost was like $16 million. But the community wanted to do it because the material benefits of moving to renewables is great. Like they had to turn power off at 10 o'clock at night, and there's no power overnight, and it's a very remote community. And when you're barging in diesel, that's potential for diesel spill, and that's our breadbasket. That's where we get our food. So being able to uphold those community voices and fighting for them over time, because they take time to build, is so key. Like supporting the communities, and that's what I try to do, and that's why it's so important to hear from the communities. Is like, well, where are your barriers? How can I help you? Is it policy? Is it regulatory? Is it these high-level questions around the ratepayers versus reconciliation in regulatory environments, and how do we justify cost? Because someone's got to pay for this reconciliation. It costs money, and we don't factor in the colonial history where you benefit from affordable electricity because you built your dams and your transmission without our consent. You didn't pay for it. So there's that kind of history, and CIB funding, helps facilitate that reconciliation where we're now bringing in First Nations in as partners. And so, being able to work with our partners on addressing these questions so that we can ensure affordability, we can ensure projects get built on time, on budget, so that we'll have clean electricity, jobs for our communities, and being able to build, as that previous speaker said. That's what we want. We need to build. We're already behind. We have short timelines. We need to get going.
Thanks. Hillary, anything to add to that?
I would just add that, I talk to a lot of community leaders, and Alberta is a great example of where a lot of community leaders keep talking about that they would love for their communities to be retooled, reskilled in the renewable space. They've been really reliant on jobs and employment in the oil and gas sector, which has been great for their wealth and being able to provide for their families. But they see a transition happening, and they are working to retool. So they're now making investments in the solar, the wind projects in Alberta, and that it's really encouraging to see because communities are ahead of the game. I do see that there's a question from the audience, and can I take a quick stab at this? So I know that we're kind of close to time, but I just thought it was an interesting question around what technologies and project types, i.e. transmission, generation, critical minerals, best lend themselves to Indigenous partnerships. And I just wanted to say that I think one of the key pieces that industry can learn from communities and from relationships is that relationships need to start early. And so it's really hard to answer this question independent of the community we're talking about. So they give an example of a large turbine in Nunavut that was canceled because of concerns with caribou. Caribou are sacred to Inuit. Caribou is lifeline. It is food for families. It is a sign of the environment. It's a sign of a healthy environment. And so if you're going to put up turbines and it's in the where caribou mate or herd or whatever caribou do, calve, this is really important, and it probably won't be accepted by the local Inuit community. Same thing has happened. We're working on a transmission line, and the concern was that with this massive straightaway of clear cut, you would have the wolves would actually be able to have access to the woodland caribou. That was in Northern Ontario. It was a big issue. So, we worked with the elders from the communities. We worked with the community concerns to redesign how the transmission line would be built so that it actually moved. Maybe not the most cost effective, but it moved so that the caribou herd wouldn't be decimated, because they would be decimated by the wolves' clear access and view of them. So I think it's really about relationships. I go back to relationships and bringing and working with communities really early in the development of projects. You can learn a lot about the land that you plan to work on. Communities can give you so much insight, great insight that you can't get from a desktop study. You can start a desktop study and place where you're going to put your turbines or where you're going to put your towers for your transmission lines. And you talk one conversation with the community, they'll tell you why you can't build it there, because there's going to be problems with whether it's a species at risk or whether it's waterways, et cetera. And so you can save a lot of time and money by just working with communities early in the process. So it's really hard to answer the question, but all of these things lend themselves to Indigenous partnerships, whether it's critical minerals or renewable energy. It's just about how you go about your relationship with the community you want to work with.
Can I just quickly add to that?
Yeah.
Yes, that's all perfect. I just also add towards government and utilities is send signals. Don't just kind of give us a short window so that we have very limited time to build those relationships. Give us signals, give us time to work on those relationships, because they take time. So give us that lead up time, and to governments provide capacity supports to First Nations so that they can make informed decisions on the various technologies around critical minerals or a new type of carbon management, carbon removal, new technologies that people might not understand. So being able to make informed decisions on that.
I'm going to end in kind of a interesting way on.
Section, if that's okay?
Yes, please go ahead, Lisa.
I really liked what Cole has said about Indigenous rights, and then Hillary on relationships. And I think the relationship building is a really crucial aspect of, doing those energy projects in collaboration with Inuit. But to the question of the future, Canada has to fully integrate Indigenous rights into all clean energy policy and initiatives. So this involves really national and provincial regulations along with international agreements. We need to ensure that the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is taken into account when we look at policies and how governments will work with us. So by ensuring that Indigenous rights are recognized, we can create the legal foundation that empowers our leadership, Indigenous leadership in energy development. I think that's something very important to keep in mind. We have to continue to communicate and educate that the respect of our rights is climate action. And it needs to be built into Canada's future as a leader in this area. So that's something we should keep in mind. And that leads to our full and effective participation and meaningful engagement within these projects. So governments and private sector stakeholders should adopt frameworks that ensure that Indigenous peoples aren't just consulted. You know, we speak about consultation, the need to build relationships, the need to take the time. You can't just go into the community and say, check, we did it, we did consult, but Inuit and First Nations and Métis need to be engaged in the decision-making process. And that doesn't come just with check marks. So making that point clear. So I'm going to end here, but I'm so appreciative of this opportunity to have shared with each of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. And just to close this out, I want to talk a little bit really shortly about the importance of cultural identity and who we are and the work that we do, knowing that we're out of time and over time. When you ask a normal, Canadian, what's your culture? For the most part, the conversations I've had, responses, I'm Canadian, we don't really have one. And on December 2nd, 2013, I was sitting with Sarah Jerome, my first week working at the Gwich'in Tribal Council, moved home from Alberta. She asked me, what does it mean to be proud to be Gwich'in? And, it's on our flag. It's something that I've never thought about. So I want to end with asking each of you, from your own nation, whether it be Inuk, Métis, or First Nation, and specific to the nation that you come from, what does it mean to you to be proud to be Gwich'in or Métis? And I'll start with Hillary.
It's a very challenging question. Some of you may know Métis are of mixed ancestry. And so the pride I have is that and I think it's not necessarily just about being Métis. It's my identity as Métis, as Canadian, is that I have an opportunity to use my voice, to use my power within the spheres of the rooms that I get to network with, to make a difference for future generations, something that my grandmother never had the opportunity to do, something that my mother was ashamed of, having Indigenous identity. And so I get to stand up and make sure that the future looks better and brighter, not just for Métis, but for other Indigenous youth and communities that I get to work with. So I have a lot of pride because of my ancestry, and that it gives me a platform to be a change maker. And that's it's because of my identity I have a lot of connection to communities far and wide in the country. I'm married, as I said, to an Inuk from Nunatsiavut, and he and I both work in this space, and we get to work with communities and youth all over the country. And the future for this country of Canada is bright, and I see it through the eyes of the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit youth.
Thank you. And we'll go over to Lisa, and then Cole.
Oh, thank you. I'm not sure how to answer the question, but I think when I look back to how I grew up with my grandparents, being raised by my grandparents in only Inuktitut, but also being raised to recognize my kin and having that relationship that formed my identity, actually. My name is Khiloqi, as I said earlier, and that was the basis of how I began to identify myself within my kin. And with this foundation, I'm brought up to contribute. Other Inuit are brought up to contribute to their community, to be helpful, to being raised with Inuit values. So what I'm hoping is that I'm bringing these values to my work internationally. And it shows that we, as human beings on this earth, we're working constantly for the betterment of our communities. And I think that's what my grandfather raised me with in order to help my fellow Inuit.
Thank you, Lisa. Cool.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a tough question. But I think it starts with my name, Kwatuma. It comes from the Taiyihawit of Tokwat. And it reminds me that while many people call our home home, our roots are always the deepest in knowing my relations, who my families are. And that it always comes back to the ocean. We're ocean-going people, and I recognize the land, but again, the ocean is also very important, and it connects us to people like the Kanaka in Hawaii and the Maori, and provides us life. And we were whalers. We had the best canoes. But I'm also terrified of the ocean. So Creator has a sense of humor. So, so there's that. Keep humbling, I guess, is a good one.
Well, I really, really want to thank you all, and just say to the audience and those joining us online that I wanted to try to end this conversation in a way that allows you to understand where we come from and the importance of Indigenous knowledge in the way that we started this whole panel and conversation, that reciprocity, that our knowledge, that our relationships, we're people of the land, and as human beings, we all come from the land, regardless of how many thousands of years it might have taken us to get here. We all come from the land, and we need to ensure that we are taking the necessary steps to build renewable energy projects, but not just in the sense of battling climate change, but ensuring that we are changing our mindset from what it is to what it needs to be. So thank you all, and thanks, fellow panelists.
Wow. I guess my question to the audience right now is, how do you feel? I might be biased as an Indigenous woman. I feel very grounded, and I feel pretty hopeful. The words that were just shared with us, the expertise and teachings, I think something to note is, not only do these incredible people, and as Jordan mentioned, Cole in his very youthful way right now, back behind what they have to say is generations of knowledge, generations of teachings that has been passed down through story. And I think that was a very important question. And I think when I asked the question about feeling, that's something that we're all challenged by, right? I think the conversation for the most part of the day is around technology and business and innovation, and we can become so far removed from our connection as kin, and not only as people and businesses and communities working together, but they brought nature into the room just now. They brought the caribou into the room. They brought the ocean into the room just now. And those are, to use the language of the audience, key stakeholders in the future that we need to ensure sustains. And I think that's the power of including Indigenous people in energy projects moving forward. And I think, grounding ourselves in those teachings and those values is essential. So another big round of applause for a great panel. So a few things from that. The clean energy transition will not happen without Indigenous leadership and participation. And those perspectives and experience on what it means for clean energy projects across the country, and why Indigenous participation and leadership in the net zero transition, that's a critical part of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission process. And I think even further to that, the concept of free, prior, and informed consent came up. And we're talking a lot about cooperation, collaboration, and I think a key term we have to get very comfortable with is consent and informed consent. And as Cole mentioned, prior consent. And when we talk about informed consent, we're talking about the advancement of energy projects across this country and globally. You know, there's a lot of global missions happening right now between Canada and other economies around the world. And a key part of that is including Indigenous voices in those missions, because, you know, as we heard from Michael earlier, Michael Sabia was, you know, how many energy projects are you going to have without Indigenous people and communities a part of those projects? Not a lot. And so not only is it essential and good for business, but it's the right thing to do, right? And we're all participating in an energy transition, and so make it just and make it equitable. So, you have a 2-minute break now. I couldn't not. That was such a juicy conversation, but we have a very short break. So I urge you, if you gotta do your thing, go get a snack, get a drink, take a bathroom break, but come back as soon as you can. We're gonna take our seats, and then we're gonna welcome our next speaker. So thank you.